Services, and then we'll open it up for Q&A discussion. So currently, the landfill methane outreach program and RFS2 programs list different opportunities that exist in the marketplace. You'll see that there are over 40 BTU or LNG alternative fuel projects that are currently in operation. This covers about 15 states, and that's updated on a regular basis. The opportunities are growing. RFS2 currently has at least 28 EPA-approved registered biogas facilities. That was as of this morning. And then the Renewable Natural Gas Coalition data is reporting that there are about 40 landfill gas or renewable natural gas projects listed. You'll see that U.S. natural gas production and imports is continuing to increase and is projected to continue to do so through 2015 and 2016, as reported by the EIA. Consumption is in line, and the supply is there to meet the consumption. EIA is constantly reporting that the projections for increase are going to continue through 2016. The prices are strong, but there has been a little bit of volatility in today's market since July. You'll see here on this screen the 2013 and 2014 RVO volumes and percentages. So we're still waiting for the final on the 2014 volumes, but there's going to be hopefully an increase across the board in increasing opportunities for cellulosic biofuel especially. Here I pulled the numbers from the EMTS for the RINs that are available to date as of August 7th. You'll see that there's a small amount of RINs available on the market. These are the total generated, available, and unlocked RINs. So you'll see there's a small 76,000 or so for cellulosic biofuel, advanced fuel a little over 110,000, and the cellulosic diesel is certainly the smallest of the mix, but a lot of opportunity there now with Pathway 2 as a final rule. I included here this slide for the LCFS marketplace. We're going to continue to see interest in LCFS opportunities across the board. RDO, CNG, LNG, and biodiesel are going to start filling a lot of the need that's there for LCFS. A lot of times I get the question of why should we consider LCFS. The combination of the pricing that you can get from the credits and the RINs allow for smaller operations to offset a lot of production costs, and you can develop a lot of forward-moving contracts, which allows for cash flow, and there's a lot of opportunity there. And so Genscape has been assisting the navigation of LCFS registration and understanding the marketplace with producers as this becomes a larger opportunity. A lower CI value is favored, and so LNG and CNG projects allow for that lower CI value, which is why you'll see an increase in that market interest. Now we'll cover what has changed in the Pathways 2 with the new definitions and what they're considering the producer role. Right now, the EPA is going to review any registrations on a case-by-case basis, and they are preferring that marketers act as the RIN generators and will be technically qualified as the producer as well. A marketer will be required to have an annual attestation similar to a renewable fuel producer, and they will be considered the liable party. Essentially, the EPA has said that they're not going to designate where along the supply chain the marketer or the producer has to fall, but they want that marketer, the RIN generator, liable party, to be able to produce at any point in time all of the collection documents related to production. So affidavits, base contracts, they'd need to be able to have access to monitoring data systems for fuel traceability throughout the entire process, from the collection of the raw biogas or electricity to the distribution of transportation fuel. And you'll see there listed what they consider to be those points along the process. And again, a note that there's no designation of who they're going to consider the producer along the way. They just want that producer or RIN generator to be able to produce the paperwork. Listed here, the new and revised definitions that are in Pathways 2, not going to cover every single one of them. One to make note of is that, biogas is now going to be considered the feedstock, and LNG, liquefied natural gas, and CNG, compressed natural gas, will be the renewable fuel. Iris will touch base on the changes that they've made to what they consider nameplate capacity in terms of registration. And you'll see that corn kernel fiber has become another eligible portion of the crop residue definition, as well as they've updated anaerobic and agricultural digester for cellulosic biofuels, and I'll touch base on that in the next slide. Here is an update on the available, what they're going to view as the available feedstocks. Obviously, for the D3 and the D5 codes, this is the whole point of Pathways 2, and so this has opened up a lot of new opportunities for the market space. And Iris will touch base on a little bit more of how this will be important when you're going through the registration process, from what needs to be reviewed and what needs to be in line for the engineering review. Here I've broken out a little bit more about the cellulosic biofuels qualifying from agricultural or anaerobic digester food waste. There is a minimum cellulosic content of 75% that's required in order to be eligible for D3 or D7 cellulosic RENs. They're estimating that the average content will be greater than 75% cellulosic. And there's additional types of renewable biomass that may be processed within these anaerobic digesters and additionally qualify. So you'll see that non-manure animal waste and separated food waste that are made up predominantly of starches or sugars are available to be processed in waste digesters and produce biogas. The D5 advanced RENs eligible for fuels as they qualify for the 50% GHG reduction threshold for advanced fuels. So there's a little bit more paperwork involved in this, but they've opened up a lot more avenues for qualifying for these REN types. There's the revised definition of renewable biomass, which will also include separated yard waste and food waste from cooking and grease traps. So I'll turn it over now to Iris. She'll be able to go over the registration requirements.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. So thank you again, everyone, for sticking with us through those technical difficulties at the beginning. But now, as Jackie said, I'm going to switch to discussing the producer registration requirements specifically for renewable fuel producers that are registering with EPA. And to the left of the screen, I've identified what have been existing requirements for registration essentially since the beginning of the program. And when I'm speaking on this registration or these renewable fuel producer registration requirements, I'm speaking kind of in the context of specifically biogas projects. So projects that are taking biogas and converting, producing a CNG, LNG, or renewable electricity fuel, as Jackie had indicated, under the pathways that allow for D3 and D5 generation, RIN generation. So on the left, again, have been the existing registration requirements. The registration package that's submitted to EPA has to address all of these components, including really kind of a basic description of how that renewable fuel is going to be produced, specifically listing out the feedstocks that are going to be used to produce that renewable fuel, a description of the production process, including process diagrams if appropriate, an identification of any co-products that might be produced in addition to that renewable fuel, as well as identifying any process heat fuels that may be consumed in that production process. And while I'm speaking on that point, one thing that we've seen come up in several cases, specifically with biogas projects, and maybe more specifically in some of the landfill projects that we've worked on, is that it's quite common in landfill gas upgrade systems to include a thermal oxidizer or some similar sort of equipment to treat waste gases that are generated during the upgrade process. So cleaning up that landfill gas to a cleaner fuel product that can be compressed or liquefied or used in an engine to generate electricity. And specifically, those thermal oxidizers may consume an auxiliary fuel such as propane or pipeline natural gas, or in some cases even some of the final sales gas that's being produced by the facility. And EPA has clarified for us that they consider those auxiliary fuels to in fact be process heat fuels. So if you do have a facility that does have a thermal oxidizer that's consuming an auxiliary fuel, you want to make sure that included in your registration package is a process heat fuel supply plan. Now that's really not as scary as it sounds. The plans themselves are really straightforward. There's a couple of requirements. You need to identify the fuel, you need to identify the fuel supplier, and then in the instance of that fuel being a biogas, you need to provide an affidavit from that biogas supplier, again confirming the intent of them to supply that biogas for this process or this purpose, as well as some quality and quantity information. So again, something specific to some of the landfill projects that we've worked on, and something to consider as you are preparing your registration package. Other requirements as part of that registration package include baseline volume calculations, which again include the peak capacity of your plant and supporting records for, again, those calculations or any supporting information. Also potentially separated waste plans. If your plant processes separated yard waste or food waste or municipal solid waste as feedstocks, then you would need to prepare a separated waste plan. And then finally, the last component of the existing requirements is the third-party engineering review report. And I'll speak on this in a couple of slides in further detail, but essentially as part of the registration process, all of your registration information needs to be reviewed by a third-party engineer, and that third-party engineer then produces a report that needs to be submitted to EPA along with the rest of your registration. So as I said, those have been the existing requirements and practices for registering a facility as a renewable fuel producer with EPA. And under the Pathways 2 requirements issued in July and then finalized or effective in August, there were some new or additional requirements that I've listed on the right side of the slide. I'm really only going to focus on 3 of those, again, that we feel are most relevant to biogas projects. And as Jackie had mentioned, one is the nameplate capacity definition that's been introduced. And then I'll also speak on some new record and documentation requirements for contractual pathways for biogas projects specifically, as well as documentation requirements for the quantity, quality, and other relevant factors that may be necessary as part of your registration. You can move to the next slide. Okay, thanks. So as far as nameplate capacity, essentially, EPA is acknowledging that they had received a lot of questions and concerns, I think probably a lot of cases from biogas facilities that didn't have the documentation as it had been identified in the regulation or existing regulation related to how to determine your baseline volume, and potentially part of that is determining your actual peak capacity of your facility. The regulation had identified that if you have a permit that specifies that capacity, then essentially that's how you establish your volume. Alternatively, you could use production records if you had historical production records, and there were some requirements associated with that. But I think essentially what EPA is acknowledging is that there's some instances, particularly with new facilities that haven't been in operation, that information may not be available. So there's essentially a new option in the Pathways 2 rule that allows facilities to use a nameplate capacity, or maybe what some of you would refer to as a design capacity, as a means of establishing your peak capacity and your baseline volume for your production facility. Now there's some specific conditions in which you can use this option. Essentially, you cannot use this option if you do have a permit that specifies a capacity. You also cannot use this option if you have available production data. So there's certainly preferential options for establishing your baseline volume and peak capacity, but if neither of those are available or do not specify the information necessary to establish a capacity, then you now have this option to use a design capacity. Additionally, there's another requirement that you cannot be also claiming an exemption under 80.1403 Part C and D, which essentially is an exemption related to your life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So let's say you do qualify for this option. Essentially, what we would be looking for as an engineering firm reviewing your registration information, and as we understand what we think EPA is looking for, is peak design capacity records, preferably something that's an independent, objective source of evidence, an engineering diagram, equipment specifications, something that's going to clearly identify a design capacity for your facility. And again, this record would be provided to your engineer as part of that engineering review process to review and confirm, and then also would be specified and included in your registration package. We can move to the next slide.
Hey, Iris, can you touch base on if you went with the peak design option? I know people have asked if you then have to, even post-approval, have to follow up later on once you get more data, or is the peak design capacity okay for the approval and then you continue on operationally?
Right. So I think, and certainly we've seen this, especially again with, I think, new facilities that are starting up and may have somewhat limited or kind of splotchy production data available. I think EPA has provided a lot of comment and review on the information that's provided to establish that capacity. And I think the expectation is certainly if you have some sort of expansion or improvement to your process, that information would be updated in your registration file with EPA. And as long as that expansion or improvement to your process doesn't result in a change in the actual fuel you're producing, I don't believe that should require any additional review by that third-party engineer. So again, the engineering review process is part of the initial registration. Again, there would be some initial information that would need to be reviewed by the engineer at that time to establish that capacity. But if there are any changes in the future, those can be updated directly with EPA.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. I've had that question come a few times. So.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a fair one. Okay. On this next slide, as I had mentioned, one of the other requirements in the new Pathways 2 regulation relates to the contractual pathway and documentation requirements associated with that. So here I've tried to kind of diagram what we would consider one of the more complex types of project scenarios. We have multiple contracts and potential points of custody transfer from kind of the biogas source, in this case I've indicated a landfill, through all the way to an end user of some sort, such as a fleet manager. So again, it's quite possible that you would have a source facility, a separate entity that's then treating that gas, upgrading it to pipeline quality. It's injected into a commercial distribution system or pipeline system. Then the gas is withdrawn by a production facility that's potentially going to liquefy the gas into a LNG type product or a CNG type product, or potentially now renewable electricity. And then finally, you may have additional parties following that facility that are identified as end users that are going to be consuming that fuel in their fleets or vehicles. So essentially what, and there's always been this requirement to provide contracts and so forth to demonstrate, how all of these parties are related. But what EPA has clarified in Pathways 2 is at the time of registration, they expect to see that contractual pathway defined. And those records, either contracts, and they're also providing the option to use affidavits between parties or representing parties to again help establish that contractual pathway. And again, affidavits are typically anticipated being used in the event that you don't have contracts available. The contractual pathway also is meant, and the review of the records associated with it is also meant to demonstrate that the fuel is being used for transportation purpose. Again, that's really the critical component of understanding what's going on at the distribution end and understanding what end users are going to be purchasing that fuel. And also confirming that there's no other party that's going to be relying on the volume of fuel for RIN generation. As I said, the expectation is that this information is going to be provided at the time of registration. So there really is a strong expectation by EPA that you've thought through the entire contractual pathway when you're at the point of registering as a facility or a renewable fuel producer. And again, I'll mention it's our understanding that if, for instance, you're using affidavits to help demonstrate that contractual pathway, that those affidavits would be coming ideally from end users such as fleet managers confirming, again, their intent to purchase as well as that they'll be using the fuel for a transportation purpose. Okay, we can go to the next slide. The other relatively new documentation requirement, at least as it relates to the registration information, is the biogas quantity and quality. So here I've identified some additional requirements that are called out specifically in Section 1480, 1450, which is the registration section of the regulation, but really tie back to other regulatory requirements in the RFS2 standard itself. The expectation here is that at the time of registration, again, there are contracts in place that specify the quantity of biogas or renewable fuel that's going to be purchased. So as engineers reviewing this information, you can certainly expect us to ask to see those records. The registration package itself and supporting records must identify the heat content or expected heat content of the fuel. In the case of renewable electricity projects, the percent efficiency of transfer, and then other potential conversion factors that may be relevant when you're establishing your baseline volume or what you anticipate using to determine your quantity of RINs. And specifically, I've highlighted here the citation from 80.1426 that specifies there has to be an ability to compare the amount of fuel that's sold as a transportation fuel to the amount of fuel that was derived from biogas and that was placed into the commercial distribution system. And again, sometimes there may be unit differences, there may be gas quality differences between these points of comparison. So it's important that at the registration phase and again in your discussions with the engineer that's reviewing your package, that everyone's on the same page as far as any conversion factors that may be used or relevant kind of gas quality information that's applicable in those instances. And again, as I've been mentioning, the expectation, of course, is that all of this documentation will be provided to the third-party engineer who's performing your review. Okay, next slide. Here I've just outlined a couple other registration considerations, again, when you're pursuing that initial EPA registration. Something that we see or would like to see more often, I guess I could say, is that as a producer, I think it's really important to present the information that I've outlined up until this point in a very kind of clean, orderly format. And probably ideally we would like to see that kind of documented in what we call a project plan or some sort of document that establishes, okay, here are the requirements, this is specifically how our project is meeting them. And not only does that certainly help expedite our review, kind of streamline our process, but as we understand it, it also makes the review process easier for EPA as well. So if you're starting out or if you're in the process of doing that registration, please consider that, because I think it does make everyone's lives a lot easier, as well as I think going through the process of having to kind of point by point identify requirements and then how you're establishing them in a project-specific case is a helpful exercise to go through anyway to make sure you have everything in line. Specifically, because some of these records that we're requesting to review and that are required to be submitted to EPA can be really lengthy and involved documents. Certainly another recommendation we make is to, if you're going to provide the entire permit or contract, which of course we would suggest you do, then try to highlight or indicate what are the relevant sections or clauses that tie back to whatever the requirement is. So again, if the requirement is to demonstrate that the contract specifies that the fuel will be used for a transportation purpose, then try to identify for us in that contract specifically where that is addressed. And again, that just makes the whole process a lot easier for everyone. Also, just to note, because I think there at times has been some confusion on this, the registration package, so again, all of those requirements I've gone through related to what information has to be provided to EPA, that package itself is a complete package entirely separate from the engineering review. Now, the two can be submitted together, and in fact, I think that's what EPA has indicated they prefer, but it's not that our engineering review, say, is going to meet the requirements that are generally required in the registration. So you do need to provide your baseline volume calculations, and although we will also perform baseline volume calculations and confirm the accuracy of yours, our calculations do not substitute, I guess, your calculations included. So again, try to think of those two. I mean, they're certainly related. The engineering review is a review of all that registration information, but the registration package itself should be complete in its own right. And then also just a note regarding registration roles. Given that there has been some kind of change in philosophy, I think, with EPA regarding the identification of producer, as Jackie had described, I think it's important to also recognize that if you're currently registered as a marketer in the CDX and EMTS system, that you may need to update your registration to potentially be a RIN owner or a producer or whatever role you intend to operate in. Your registration should be reflective of that. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. And now here I just have a couple slides more specifically on that engineering review process. So here we have that same diagram that I was using for the contractual pathway. There had been, I think, some confusion early on with specifically biogas projects and understanding the scope of the third-party engineering review and specifically which facilities, given kind of an extended or potentially complex pathway, which facilities would require a site visit by your third-party engineer. So in the Pathways 2 regulation, EPA has clarified that they're requiring site visits of any facility up until the point of pipeline injection. So if you're dealing with a commercial distribution project, any of those facilities, so your source facility, your treatment plant, site visits would be required up until again, the injection point into the pipeline. That site visit is accompanied with, of course, a record review. So any records that corroborate what's observed on site are necessary in order to complete the engineering review. And then subsequent to the pipeline injection, so from essentially the pipeline withdrawal point to the end users, EPA is allowing engineers or third-party engineers to perform the review of those requirements simply by a record review. Now in some cases, and depending on your specific project, it might be preferential to still do site visits after the point of withdrawal from the pipeline. But again, that's something you can discuss with your third-party engineer. But according to EPA, minimum requirement is that a record review subsequent to the point of withdrawal from the pipeline is sufficient. Okay, next slide. And here I've just outlined the sorts of information you can expect to provide to your third-party engineer. Probably most of this should be somewhat logical given what we've been discussing at this point. Again, the third-party engineering review is a review of all of the relevant information included in your registration package. So you can expect to provide to the third-party engineer facility design documents, process descriptions, process flow diagrams, those sorts of things. Any supply plans, again, separation plans if relevant, process fuel supply plans as I had discussed. Relevant permits, air permits or operating permits, again, may be relevant for determining your baseline or peak capacity, but also may be relevant just for confirming the operation of the facility itself. Contracts and affidavits, again, through the entire contractual and project pathway. And related to that then is also demonstrating the physical pathway, which I haven't really focused on too much, but that is and has been an existing requirement. Again, if you're dealing with multiple facilities in your supply chain, you need to be able to demonstrate that there's a physical connectivity between those parties. So a pipeline diagram, for instance, potentially transaction records or other records to demonstrate that it's physically possible to transport your fuel from your biogas source all the way through to the end user. Also calculations, supporting calculations for your baseline volume, your actual peak capacity, again any of those conversion factors, we would typically request those. And then also production data. If available, we'll review historic volume, energy content, gas quality data, and also at the relevant points along the pathway. So certainly you can expect to provide that information at your source and initial treatment facilities, in the instance of like a landfill, for instance. But then we also will want to see that information for any additional downstream processing facilities. So for instance, your LNG or CNG production facility will want to have an understanding of what their typical production is, so we can do relevant kind of comparisons along the way. So that's what you can expect from the engineering review itself. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to move into some of the record-keeping requirements, and then Jackie's going to pick up some additional RIN generation and reporting requirements. As far as record keeping, again here I've outlined some of the general requirements for renewable fuel production facilities, product transfer documents, any of the reports that are submitted to EPA, as again Jackie will discuss, supporting records for RIN generation, so again any of the supporting documentation relevant to the amount of RINs that you claim, any records of RIN transactions, including sale, use, renewable fuel production records, importation, and then finally copies of that registration package or supporting documentation initially provided to EPA. Now specific to LNG, CNG, and electricity facilities, and some of these have been clarified again in Pathways 2, there needs to be records documenting the sale of fuel, again from the point of biogas production all the way through to the end use. At various points along that pathway you also need to be able to produce records of volume and energy content, which I'll go into a little bit more detail on the next slide. And then on a quarterly basis, there's a requirement that you have evidence of that fuel being used specifically for a transportation purpose. And in the past, I believe the requirement had been simply provide affidavits demonstrating that the fuel was used for transportation purpose. In Pathways 2, EPA has also identified what they're generically referencing as EPA-approved documentation. And then there's also the option to use real-time electronic monitoring, if that's available, again to demonstrate that this fuel is strictly used for transportation purpose. And then finally, requirements to maintain and keep records of compliance certifications required under the Title V of Clean Air Act, so Title V permit requirements. Next slide.
I'll just jump in real fast before I take over. So all of these requirements are still, that the registered RIN generator, I guess the marketer in this instance, has to be able to maintain these documents for up to 5 years. There hasn't been any change on that requirement.
Yes, that's a good point. And maybe I'll also add to that technically in the regulation there are some distinctions between if your project is one where the gas is injected into a commercial distribution system versus essentially a non-commercial distribution system, or what we consider more like a direct use type project. So there are some distinctions in what records have to be maintained depending on which type of project you have. But in general, I think the key thing is very clearly having records that the fuel was used for transportation purpose, and then again more relevant for the commercial side of things, if you're injecting into a commercial distribution system, then again there needs to be, it's probably more focus on that contractual pathway kind of along the course of that transfer and kind of custody, as well as then the physical connectivity of that pipeline or that distribution system itself. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And here, using the same diagram again, I've tried to kind of highlight, again, points of record keeping. So throughout the pathway, again, there needs to be records of sale, product transfer documents, bills of lading, invoices, whatever evidence is easiest and most appropriate for you to maintain. And then also there's requirements for the volume and the energy content to be monitored. In some cases, specifically when you have a commercial distribution system, or pipeline, the volume and energy content have to be monitored continuously, both at the point of injection as well as the point of withdrawal. And then essentially at the point of distribution and sale to your end user, the volume and energy content also has to be recorded. So from kind of a visual perspective, that's kind kind of what you can expect as far as record keeping along the pathway. Okay, and I think if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to turn it back to Jackie to pick up a little bit more about RIN generation and record keeping.
Yeah, I'll take over. So thank you, Iris. The RIN generation and record keeping side of things is going to be different as we navigate through the Pathways 2 changes, with emphasis placed more so on the RIN marketer from the generation standpoint. If you're a RIN marketer currently and you're only registered as a RIN owner with the blender, marketer, or trader category, you're going to have to make some updates to your EMTS and CDX registration roles prior to the production of any RIN-eligible renewable fuel, LNG, CNG, or renewable electricity. So you'll have to go in, and basically what will happen is if you are already registered under the RFS2, you'll have a company ID, and you need to update your roles in order to include renewable fuel producer and RIN generator. Any facilities that you plan to work with, and you would notify your third-party engineer throughout the registration process of those facilities, they will operate underneath your company ID with their own individual facility ID. And if they're already a registered facility and you bring them in under your registration, the EPA will review all of those on a case-by-case basis. But for RIN generation purposes, the RIN marketer is going to be assigned a company ID, and all subsequent facilities will have facility IDs associated with the RIN marketer's company ID. So basically, the RIN generation for liability purposes can be tracked back to the RIN marketer's company ID. If you're a currently registered RFS2 RIN marketer, this isn't a large update to undergo. It doesn't really, you don't lose a lot of time. There's other smaller things to reconsider to make sure that your responsible corporate officer is up to date, as well as there's more emphasis now on the electronic signature agent, ESA option. So just things to consider, that there's little tiny paperwork items that you'd have to make sure are in place within the CDX and the EMTS before you can actually go into production and generate anything that would be eligible for RIN generation. I've got it listed in here. You know, the EMTS company version access would be granted to the RIN marketer. You would become the manager of the RIN holdings, and the EPA is very aware of the fact that this industry does not necessarily operate per the standard RIN generation timeline of production and sales and EMTS generation within 5 days of those dates. So while they would certainly prefer that you operate within those windows because it would be easier for them to keep everybody on a similar schedule, they're going to review on a case-by-case basis. So if you have your projects in line and during the engineering review, which Iris spoke about, part of it would be a discussion with the EPA directly about how you would plan to go in and generate your RIN. The business tends to operate on a 30-day basis. So again, they're painfully aware of the fact that this would be hard to follow the normal guidelines, and that's why they left it a little bit gray in Pathways 2. Case by case is what they're going to try to work with. Any of the registered facilities that are associated with a RIN marketer are going to have access to the EMTS, but they won't generate RIN. And so, you know, again, it all falls on the RIN marketer as the liable party. I put in here that also, you know, D5 RINs will become eligible for D3 for compliance purposes. And then you'll see here that there's a note. We're just trying to make sure that everyone's aware that even if you've previously been registered under the RFS2 and had EMTS access, if you've been inactive for a certain amount of time, the EMTS is fairly soon going to go through and start doing automatic deactivations. So if you're looking at re-exploring this marketplace and you're already registered, you need to follow up and make sure that you don't get deactivated because of inactivity. That would be problematic to getting your projects off the ground running smoother and faster. So just a note there that that's going to be happening soon. So I included this slide about liability and risk mitigation. Back to what Iris was talking about earlier, where the collection of the affidavit-based contracts and the real-time monitoring data. The EPA is considering the RIN marketer the liable party, and again, they have to be able to account for everything from the raw collection to the endpoint when it's put into distribution for use as transportation fuel. So, you know, the stipulations are that in order to generate RINs on any volume of LNG, CNG, or renewable electricity, it's going to have to be used as transportation fuel, and that's duly noted on all of your paperwork. Again, the EPA is going to go through and have approved RIN generation protocols for companies, and this will be another step that they'll use to mitigate any risk of generating RINs for a volume of LNG, CNG that maybe, you know, doesn't fall in with the normal timelines, and also to make sure that it's, you know, collected and distributed within a manner that's consistent with the regulation. If there was to be a case of invalid RIN generation, you would work as the RIN marketer. You would work directly with the EPA support team, and they would guide you through the steps for remedial actions. I've got a note included here that the use of the remedial action should only be used on an if necessary basis. It should never become part of your standard practice as a company to always work in the backwards of RIN generation. It's just harder to go in and manage those types of things. So taking a proactive step in the registration process and trying to have all of your RIN generation protocols in place during registration is better than having to deal with any type of invalid RIN generation or remedial action. Although it happens, and I'm sure Iris can speak to some of that, as well as, you know, if there's something that happens in the registration process for the engineering review or the project plan, if anything changes and it slips through the cracks or it doesn't get reported back to the EPA, there are certain grace periods allowed for that before remedial action becomes the ultimate step. I've listed out here what's required reporting requirement-wise. You'll see just the standard EPA quarterly and annual reporting schedule to the left. So it's going to be required that you do the standard RFS2 activity report on a quarterly basis. For the RIN generators, you'll be required to do the Renewable Fuel Producer Supplemental Report. That's on a quarterly basis as well. The renewable biomass report will be required. That would be noted in your engineering review if you're going to be required to do that. Everyone's required to do an outlook production report. And then I have a note here for LNG and CNG RIN generators. You're going to have to be able to report a total energy production and supply as used for transportation fuel that you've collected via metering of gas or electricity. And this will also include that data from your distribution location. Iris touched base a little bit on that in the registration process. So these reporting requirements shouldn't come as a surprise on a quarterly or annual basis in terms of the data and the documents that you'd be required to submit. Just know that you would have to do it for, you know, as a RIN generator, you're going to have to do it for your company and your individual facilities. I'll step in real fast just to touch base on the E15 mitigation requirements and the amendments that they've made to the ultra-low sulfur fuel survey via Pathways 2. The sampling for RVP during high ozone or according to state implementation plans for the Clean Air Act have been updated. The non-compliant samples must be reported to the EPA within 24 hours of analysis. That's a new requirement. And on top of that, they've made some changes to the PTDs. Basically, they're saying now that, you know, that they've looked at some of the product codes that are associated with what needs to be on the product transfer documents, and they've made some changes to that. They're allowing for a little bit more flexibility for the parties in terms of what product codes are listed related to upstream and downstream use. For the ULSD, the ultra-low sulfur diesel provisions, they have changed the number of annual sampling size. They've dropped it from 5,250 samples to 1,800 on an annual basis. For now, they're going to go ahead and continue to monitor the national compliance rates before they make any other changes to the survey. Again, yeah, continued assessment of the refiner interest. And if there's not as much interest, then they'll continue to assess possibly reducing further sample size requirements in the future. As part of the Genscape portion of the webinar, I just wanted to touch base on our QAP services. I know that my colleagues Susan Olson and Jim Benhoff have been very vocal on the QAP services that we offer, and we're certainly excited to continue moving into this space, especially now that Pathway 2 has been finalized, and there's going to be a lot of opportunity there. So you can see that we offer a very quick, we like to have our QAP onboarding timelines done within about, I don't know, 90 to 120 days, depending on the project schedule on your end. So we've been working with biogas facilities for a while now, and we're excited to continue to move further into that space. And so this is a typical timeline that we have, and you know, we're ready to continue moving forward as the QAP rule has been finalized earlier this year, and looking forward to the opportunities in 2015. So my team's very good at what they do on that side of things, and we're always available to take questions and work with you through your project, including registration questions and navigating those issues. So Iris, did you have anything else you wanted to chime in on before we move into the questions and answers section?
No, I think you did a nice job summarizing those requirements.
Great. Okay.
So, yeah, I know we've just exceeded our hour, and again, apologize for the technical difficulties we had at the beginning. But maybe we can take just a couple questions. So feel free, certainly feel free to submit questions, and we'll be following up afterwards with you individually with you know, clarification as necessary. But maybe here's a market-related question. Jackie, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but we had a question about our general view on the marketability of D3 RINs, particularly given the low 2014 RVO and the availability of cellulosic waiver credits. So the question is essentially, why would an obligated party be interested in D3?
Why would they be interested in a D3 RIN versus just buying the waiver credits?
Right, right.
Yeah. This question has come in a lot. There's not, I don't have a lot of good indicators right now that in 2014 it's going to make sense to purchase the D3 RINs versus just the waiver credits. But you know, as the option is there now for conversion, it would become, you know, something. It's an option to explore if you're meeting your compliance obligations versus just buying the waiver credits. I don't have a lot of experience with why they might make that shift from the waiver credits to the actual, you know, to the D3 RIN.
Okay, okay. Another question we got was related to the use of affidavits again. So there's been a lot of I think discussion on this point certainly, and I think EPA considered you know, did put quite a lot of thought into, again, the use of affidavits throughout the registration and record-keeping process. But I guess this particular attendee had some concern that they didn't see affidavits specifically called out as an option in the regulation. And I guess I don't have the specific regulatory references in front of me right now, but I can confirm, in fact, I think in 80.1426 and 1450, at least, affidavits are now specifically spelled out as you know, appropriate means of record keeping. So that is definitely an allowable option under now.
Oh, I can agree. I mean, having several discussions about this, you know, affidavits will be you know, widely accepted, and it's an option that they know is necessary in order to keep the industry moving along.
Right, right. Okay, well with that, we're now 10 minutes after the hour, so I think again if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact either Jackie or myself. We're always willing and interested in speaking to you about these sorts of projects and issues.